Good morning and welcome to One-on-One with H1, an industry webinar series. Thanks for spending some time with us today. My name is Elizabeth Fennell. I'm the Director of Integrated Marketing for H1. Today we're presenting how tracking digital opinion leaders and treatment leaders will revolutionize pharma. And today's event is presented by Nayanica Banerjee. She's the Senior Manager of Strategic Solutions at H1. A little bit about Nayanica. She's a global life sciences consultant and SME with a unique cross-functional background in biotech, engineering, pharmaceutical compliance, and medical strategy. In her current role at H1, she works closely with key players in the industry to support their medical strategy by providing data-driven insights and operational tools for effective KOL identification and engagement, MSL readiness, pre- and post-launch planning across product life cycles and therapeutic areas of interest, to name a few. A little bit about H1. H1 is the connecting force for global HCP clinical, scientific, and research information. The H1 Connect platform democratizes access to HCP knowledge and groundbreaking insights for life sciences, academic medical institutions, health systems, and payers. You can learn more about H1 at h1.co. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat and we'll get to the questions at the end. We are again asking everyone to please put your audio on mute and turn your camera off for ideal viewing. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Nayanica.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name is Nayanica. I'm very, very excited to be speaking with you today. Thank you so much for making time to join us. We have a very interesting topic, as Elizabeth said. This is actually one of my favorites. We get asked about this all the time from our clients. And so today we're going to be talking about how you can track DOLs, right, or digital opinion leaders. It's a hot topic. Everyone's talking about it. And treatment leaders, which really has the potential to revolutionize pharma. If you want to jump to the next one. So on the agenda for today, we will be learning about the recent history and evolution of pharma, right? Thought leaders specifically beyond traditional key opinion leaders or KOLs as we know them. So really understanding, who are these digital opinion leaders and treatment leaders? How can you identify them, engage them, and then enhance your KOL strategy accordingly? Also, we'll be looking at analyzing some recent market trends related to how MSLs and Med Affairs teams view some of these non-traditional KOLs, DOLs, and sort of these emerging different segments. We're also going to be reviewing a few best practices for leveraging data, right, to find and follow DOLs and treatment leaders. I personally, Elizabeth mentioned my background a little bit, just coming from an engineering background, having worked in compliance and with key pharma leaders, I'm big on having data-driven insights to support your strategy, right? So very excited to talk about some of that. And then lastly, also track an example or results of a real-life DOL analysis and how we kind of recommend you think about some of these DOLs and profiling them. Awesome. So with that, let's jump right into it. So the first topic of discussion is going to be the recent history and evolution of pharma and thought leaders. So pharma and med affairs, right, the world in particular has been going through a number of changes and evolutions lately, and we've divided some of these into these 6 broad buckets, right? So first off, let's talk about disruption. Over the past, obviously, pandemic, pre-pandemic, we've seen HCPs adapting to new models of care and, how they're managing pandemic economics, how they're managing patients, how they're seeing patients, and most importantly, how they're also interacting with pharma. So one of the key needs and ways in which I feel like pharma needs to evolve is understanding how MSLs, right, can deliver more value during HCP interactions through the newer modes, and just given that people, have that limited bandwidth and have that restriction around, meeting in person, face-to-face versus newer virtual or digital platforms. The other thing we've noticed is this whole digital transformation, right? So the landscape has changed, and this whole digital shift has really changed the way, we influence and we measure influence in your interactions. The other thing is compliance. Again, I used to have a background and work in this. So one of the things I saw, was when this whole shift happened, at first, pharma was a little bit confused, right? We didn't have those clear standards. A lot of those codes, etc., didn't cover very clearly how to respond, right? So something to keep in mind as the landscape evolves is considering how these compliance regulations are changing. They have increased scrutiny, right, around being more objective, around KOL selection, having a clear strategy, documenting it, etc. We also look at competition, right? So one of the key, again, this is, irrespective of pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, but in general, as the landscape changes, something to keep in mind is how you can gain a competitive advantage, right? Where pharmaceutical med device companies are seeking KOLs who have both clinical R&D experience, who are fitting a lot of these different buckets, right? And can be categorized, in a lot of different ways beyond just traditional KOLs. We also look at expertise and how that has evolved, right? KOL insights regarding, just total cost of care have become equally important as a product safety and efficacy. So considering that becomes key. And then lastly, transparency, right? So increased transparency is changing the way the industry operates and is driving the direction of data availability. So all of these changes, combine, and with these evolutions that pharma is going through, there comes a high need to find, influential, knowledgeable key opinion leaders based on these criteria. Pharma needs to explore some out-of-the-box ideas on how, where to find new and emerging KOLs, right, through the lens of technology and being more data-driven about it. And then overall, I would say the key summary here is understanding that what we all are really craving here and what pharma needs is building, true connections and better connections with KOLs. We jump to the next one. All right, so let's take a step back here for a second and really look at the cost and effort that's associated, right, to bringing a life-saving treatment to market, which is what really all of pharma is working on, right? So it takes 14 years, billions of dollars to bring a new drug to market. And knowing that about 30% of the world's data volume is generated by the healthcare industry, you start questioning, why don't we have a better way to exchange it and to share it, right? And to surface it, and to surface these much needed insights to the right people in a meaningful way, right? And before we start to think about reducing this effort, right, and the impact on diversity, health equity, and some of these bigger questions, some challenges to consider are, looking at how information highlighting physicians and patient diversity or demographics is limited, right? And that's one of those, I would say, drivers that is inhibiting some of this smooth flow of information and insights, right, from pharma to the right KOLs. The global healthcare data and analytics market is pretty opaque, highly fragmented, right? Curating and pulling these constantly changing data together can take months and not years, right? And then data regarding the efficacy, availability of new markets is pretty siloed. So a lot of these restrictions and inhibitions, I think, is interesting to think of, right? As we think about why, we sort of haven't found a great way to transfer some of these insights and reduce that cost burden. So in this webinar, we are going to be looking at, this one aspect of bringing drugs to market and accessing a good list of KOLs, right? And ways in which you can slice and dice this universe to just make it more meaningful and really enhance your KOL strategy, be it optimizing data management and data sources, right? Through, say, platforms like ours or otherwise, decreasing the heavy lift. That becomes very important, right, in getting treatments to market. And then how the analysis and differentiation of healthcare professionals can positively impact some of this. Let's jump to the next slide. All right, so on that note, let's talk about how Med Affairs is evolving, right? But before that, actually, there's an interesting story that I'd like to share, because I think before we think about how Med Affairs evolved, if you've ever wondered how Med Affairs came into existence, right? So in the 1940s, there was a researcher by the name of Paul Lazarsfeld who was studying how communication and influence can impact and change views and preferences. So in the mid-50s, 1950s, sorry, a company by the name of Upjohn Pharmaceuticals, today known as Pfizer commonly, they engaged Lazarsfeld to study the diffusion of medical information and innovation. So from that study, the idea of KOLs emerged, right? Because that thesis basically found out that people change their views and preferences more because of trusted figures in their network, right? Or opinion leaders as we know them, rather than because of advertising or sales pitches, right? So that's where that need, that Upjohn kind of began to retrain and leverage more scientifically knowledgeable sales rep to build, more deeper and engaging, meaningful relationships with experts or the KOLs. So that's how sort of the MSLs or the medical sales liaison was born. And then over time, the ranks of Med Affairs began to be filled with scientifically trained professionals. And today, more than 80% of the working MSLs have advanced degrees, and they're qualified to have those meaningful discussions, right? So as the profession grew, so did the demand. And starting the late 90s and early 2000s, the industry essentially began to shift, right, to a bifurcated engagement model where, on one side, Med Affairs, and on the other side, there were the commercial teams. So on the slide, as you can see, really that role kind of evolved. And today, how, MSLs and the Med Affairs play such a huge role in being that point of communication and communicating sort of key innovation and information to these KOLs and HCPs. Can we jump to the next slide? So how did we get here, right? So from that tactical, sales-centric initial mandate, right, to facilitate scientific exchange, peer-to-peer interactions with trained medical professionals, Med Affairs has always been in a flux. And where we are now is really, newer stakeholders, increased focus on rare diseases, structural changes to provision, healthcare in the US. It's transforming Med Affairs, right, and mandates and how we interact. And where we're headed, this is one thing I think it's very interesting to get to, right? I think having, a lot more data in hand to actually analyze and work with, having technologies to connect this data and actually analyze this data, and of course, newer needs, right? As the landscape changes, as we evolve, and really redefining the activities and expectations from MSLs. I think that's where we're heading, and that's how we need to think about it. So now that we heard a little bit about how sort of MSL, Med Affairs and Pharma evolved and how they're viewing and engaging with KOLs, let's look at some recent market trends on how MSLs and Med Affairs is viewing some of these non-traditional segments of KOLs, DOLs, etc. So one of the ways, I think the most effective ways, right, is to use data to identify, engage, educate, right, and accordingly enhance for successful engagement, right? So I say this all the time, having worked in compliance, in strategy now, pharma is so rich in data now, but very few people know what to do with it, right? And that's what I think, we're so rich in data, the insights is where we need to work on, right? So on this slide, really, I think it really highlights high level how in every stage, you can consider using this data, be it identifying the right HCPs, right? Who are the right HCPs to engage with? Who are other HCPs for treating patients, right? Depending on your need, depending on where your products are in your life cycle, who are you already aware of, right? Ensuring you're tracking. Are you identifying newer HCPs or KOLs? Are you segmenting them correctly? Are they truly a tier 1? Are they a tier 3, etc.? Secondly, using this data, right, to draw insights into these identified HCPs. So I spoke about how what we really need to do is make meaningful connections. And one of the ways is empowering your MSLs, right, to do, that holistic research and really understand that HCP and get those detailed insights about them. Engaging with them meaningfully, right, again, goes back to planning, prepping, using data points, and then lastly, of course, tracking, analytics after the engagement, enhancing accordingly. Let's jump to the next slide, please. All right, so scientific discourse and sort of the digital health revolution as a whole, right? So we all know, back then, the number of interactions, they were, fewer, they were more face-to-face, right? MSLs would actually go into office, make those visits and phone calls versus today, where it's a lot more digital, right? Digital social media is huge, as I said, DOLs is a hot topic. We keep hearing that all the time. So really a lot of these omni-channels, multiple channels is where we're really at, right? And where we are heading next, I think, is sort of that future state, which is going to be more about impact, right? And looking at patient outcomes. We hear, as an industry as a whole, we are focusing a lot more on what is that end impact on the patients, right? And that means also looking at, share of voice and just being a little more thoughtful and mindful around some of these data and also the type of engagements, be it digital or in person. And also looking at clinical care gap analysis, just looking at that delta and seeing where you can improve and enhance versus doing things as we have. So this slide, we actually did an interesting poll with over 600 MSLs, right? And the key question we were trying to address here is really understand what the industry, so what does Med Affairs and MSLs, what do they think about the difficulty of identifying these relevant KOLs, right, or DOLs? So one of the things we saw was, as you'll see on the top right, so in general, I always say this, pharma was anyway heading to where we are. I do think the pandemic kind of accelerated things a little bit, but when we asked these MSLs, you see majority 66.4% said that, even with the emergence of digital opinion leaders, they did see sort of, there was this elusive difficulty to kind of find the right KOLs. And then we also asked them, be it post-pandemic, where the results are to your bottom left, you'll see even then 50.6%, so majority MSLs and folks thought that the availability of finding more KOLs and finding them is still sort of a challenge, be it pre or post-pandemic. So the key insight here, I guess, is really this has always been a challenge because there's so much out there. How can we actually find the right folks? The next slide, please. So now that we spoke a lot about that evolution and potential, barriers, let's talk a little bit about how we can think of actually, finding these people and KOL strategies as a whole. So when we talk about thought leaders, right? I mean, HCPs, true opinion leaders, they really don't fit one bucket, right? There are so many different types. So existing targets, existing sort of that universe covers a bunch of different types, right? You talk about those mid-levels, NPs, PAs, midwives. You talk about true KOLs, right? Or key opinion leaders who are regularly publishing papers. They're the ones who are attending and speaking at conferences. They sit on advisory, etc. Right? There are
The digital opinion leaders.
Can you guys please make sure you're on mute? Thank you.
Me acabo de meter, es que no he visto el principio. Y
Can you please make sure you're on mute,
o
please?
sea, voy a mandar el guión ¿vale? Vale.
Right. So the other subtypes, right? So we talk about KOLs. There are digital opinion leaders who, as I keep mentioning, right? They're the ones we're really trying to find because there's so much noise out there, right? In the internet, in the Twitterverse. So these are the people who, are healthcare professionals, but they're also scientific writers who have a digital presence and an influential digital voice in the community. So unlike social media influencers, DOLs are not just trying to self-promote, right? But they're trying to educate, engage, challenge their followers, right? And they're sort of experts who are providing clear, concise scientific communication virtually, right? So really bridging that gap. and also the reason why these are the people that pharma is really trying to identify and engage with meaningfully, because they really have that, professional credentials and credibility to back their statements and share the right information with the right audience in the digital space. The one segment that, we as a company, but also when I speak with all my clients, that we're kind of surfacing a little more lately, just because I feel like pharma has started to get a good sense of who those ivory tower KOLs are. Pharma also has a good sense of who some of those bottom down local leaders or clinicians or treatment leaders are. So really, I think this subcategory that we've seen, we're kind of calling them uncut gems, right? So these are some of those allied professionals or regional treatment leaders, who are driving medical management and managing patients. And they're the ones who might not fit into that, top layer, top tier KOLs, but also not that bottom tier, sort of just clinicians or treatment leaders. And these are the uncut gems, which, I personally feel the industry is kind of going to get to next, once they have a good idea who, the rest of sort of the universe is, right? So some of these uncut gems also include rising stars, again, a commonly used, terminology, very, very up and coming category amongst KOLs. Again, they're sort of these relatively younger, up and coming experts who aren't true KOLs yet, but they're kind of getting there. But again, pharma has very quickly realized that these are some of those guys who are having a lot more influence, be it digitally as DOLs or as rising stars otherwise. Next slide, please. All right, so this is one of my favorite slides. I feel like, so when we talk about your KOL universe as a whole, right? So traditionally, I think the pyramid to the left, is a good sort of way to think about, especially even the volumes, right? Obviously, there are those relatively smaller universe of true global KOLs. You have your nationals, you have your regionals, and then you have a lot of those local, experts. However, the one thing we've seen, and I think in one way this universe is evolving, is it's hard to group them into these, broad buckets, right? I think the other way you can think of it is the image to your right, where it's more like a puzzle. It's more about figuring out, right, how they all kind of fit in amongst each other. Also, how one particular HCP could wear multiple hats, right? They could be a DOL, but also, could be seeing a ton of patients. So I feel like this image is a good representation of how, obviously, you can still think of that traditional sort of pyramid, but also start being a little more innovative about classifying your KOLs, and then also thinking about how they interact amongst themselves. Within their peers, individually, and then also with you or with pharma as a whole, and really tailor your strategy based on what you're trying to do, right? So if you're trying to enhance your digital strategy, you need to think about them from a DOL perspective versus, if you're trying to look at more of those, you have a product which is just entering market, you're trying to find more of those clinicians, but you also want an ad board. So I just think looking at it more as a puzzle is really a smarter way of doing things. All right, so the other type of thought leaders, as I mentioned, I think is really, looking at these DOLs, credentialed medical specialists with significant digital reach, right, who are producing, disseminating relevant scientific content online. So that becomes very important, just because, again, everyone's on their phones, including HCPs, including patients. So tapping into these DOLs as a resource is becoming more and more important, especially going back to that competitive advantage point, right? And the other subgroup, which again, we keep hearing about and we are trying to, identify, is rising stars, right? So I always say this, these rising stars are truly needles in a haystack. They're very rare, right? Because they're the ones who need to typically fit certain criteria, which includes, hitting some of those KOL criteria, right? They need to have publications, they need to have trials, they need to have spoken at some congresses, if not many, because that would make them a KOL. But who are some of these younger up and coming stars, right? Who are very early on in their career, have not yet had a chance to prove themselves and become KOLs, but are clearly incredibly talented, who are getting there. And the other way I like to look at rising stars is also looking at unique characteristics, right? I am big on diversity and inclusion. Again, it's something that the pharma industry is really, currently big on. And I think that is one thing that I like to look at when looking at rising stars, especially in certain particular indications, disease areas, be it HIV or be it, every indication really. I think finding some of these rising stars who are very passionate about diversity, inclusion, equity, really, I think is an interesting way of thinking about some of these rising stars and characterizing them. How are we doing on time? All right, we have 5 minutes. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. Let's talk about some best practices for leveraging data, right, to find and follow DOLs and treatment leaders. So I'm not going to go through all of these just in the best interest of time, but I think high level, right, identifying mid-levels, treating patients for a disease that you're interested in, and not just looking at KOLs or advisors, but really coupling them, right, to get that on the field, patient-driven insights, determining which HCPs have the largest footprint as a DOL, understanding the experience of thought leaders and their influence networks, building MSL territories to deliver the best coverage. All of these are sort of, standard best practices, knowing where to focus, right, in the coming year to generate and meet the most KOL interactions, also tailoring to your annual goals, to your product life cycles, key milestones they're going to meet, and then identifying KOLs for advisory boards, different activities, and tailoring your approach to identifying them, which is sort of the way, we kind of partner with our clients and leadership at Pharma as well. Let's jump to the next slide really quickly. So I'm going to skim through these very quickly because I kind of spoke to these a little bit, but as I said, think about your universe, think about how you can classify them beyond just KOLs, right? Are there some of these uncut gems, emerging leaders, rising stars, local thought leaders beyond just those, ivory tower KOLs or local leaders? Next slide, please. All right, so when we talk about DOLs specifically, this is something I personally love working on. I think the goal becomes to prioritize folks who are meeting all of these buckets, right? So ensuring their KOLs, which is typically when we look at scientific score, right? Which is looking at, do they have pubs, trials, congresses, or treatment leadership or diagnosis, right, in a specific area, but also looking at, do they have, social reach? Do they have enough followers, following, earned versus own content, which is how much they're putting out there versus people are talking about them, looking at what content they're putting out there, right? So they talk about football versus the particular disease, what timing, certain KOLs are really good about timing their posts and stuff ahead of congresses. So maybe you could leverage that when you are trying to plan for congresses and enhance sort of engagement. And then lastly, as I mentioned, when we talk about DOLs, there are different metrics that you can use, which is something, you should sort of think about. Some metrics that we use is looking at followers, looking at reach, looking at scientific versus social score. Just to clarify, reach is a very common measure. It's essentially followers, following, kind of trying to figure out how many folks they can reach, how many folks actually follow them and willing to listen to them, looking at earned and owned content, looking at impact, and then of course, looking at themes, right, that they're talking about, which really addresses some of that share of voice and relevance bit. I know we're almost at time, so I'm just going to show you a few examples, if not all. So when we're talking about, digital activity and monitoring, right, digital leadership online, I think the way H1 does it is, as I said, we take a sort of holistic approach, not just looking at metrics, not just looking at reach, but also coupling that with what they're actually talking about, because there's so much noise out there. So I think for me personally, one of the biggest challenges and interesting things to work on for clients is cutting through that noise and actually finding new DOLs who are key opinion leaders, who have a good digital footprint, and who are, talking about relevant stuff digitally. So I'll just show you one profile before we wrap up. I know we're almost at time. So I think one thing that our clients have found very helpful and something that you can think about is these scorecards, right? So obviously, in addition to analytics and looking at high-level data, finding the right people, one of the key, I think, areas that our clients struggle with is implementing some of these insights. And this is something that comes really handy, which is sharing sort of a scorecard from a digital perspective, which really helps them to plan, or by them, I mean your MSLs or field teams, just knowing what is this HCP or what is this DOL talking about? Have they tweeted about a particular, theme, a particular competitor, and then kind of, tailoring their engagement accordingly, maybe figuring out the whys, and then kind of educating them accordingly. So a scorecard like this for Dr. Erin, sharing some stats, what are the followers following reach? What is their scientific score? So as you can see, she's up top, she's number 3 for her space. She's a cardiologist. What is her scientific score, social score? And then looking at some of her tweets, which of course, you can either find in one place. So I'm big on like platforms like ours where you can really connect the dots. So you have all this digital stuff in addition to their pubs, trials, and congresses, which gives you a very holistic, view of the KOL, but also these more tailored scorecards, which really speak to their digital footprint, seems to be very helpful. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Elizabeth, are we at time or?
Hi, yes, we are actually. Thank you. And thanks for all the great information. We are going to send this deck out to those that registered. So keep an eye out for this and the recording of the presentation. Thank you, Nayanica, for all the great information. If you have additional questions after the presentation, you can go to h1.co, or Nayanica's email address is on the screen. Feel free to email her and she's happy to follow up with someone that can answer your questions. So thank you for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.